Welcome to I-24 News National Security Podcast, in partnership with INSS, the Institute for National Security Studies. I'm your host, Nicole Zedek. Each week, we'll have an in-depth discussion with expert analysts on some of the most pressing national security challenges facing Israel today. So, let's get started. It is election time in the United States, and whatever happens on November 5th will ultimately have an impact right here in Israel as well. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at how the political and military ties between the U.S. and Israel could shift depending on each candidate's leadership. This election has the potential to redefine key aspects of Israel's security landscape, from military aid and security strategies to regional dynamics with Iran and even new Arab alliances. Plus, with growing challenges to bipartisanship in the U.S., the stakes are higher than ever for Israel's support network in Washington. By examining where Kamala Harris and Donald Trump stand on issues critical to Israel's future, we'll explore how their approaches could either reinforce or challenge the U.S.-Israel alliance, and what obstacles and opportunities lie ahead for both nations in an increasingly complex Middle East. Well, to unpack this ever-changing political landscape, our guest in studio today is Avishay Ben Sasson-Gordis, a Ruderman Family Foundation visiting scholar and senior researcher at the INSS, and also a Liberalism Rekindled postdoctoral fellow at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Avishay, thanks for being with us on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me today.
There's a lot to unpack here, and in order to unpack what's happening now, let's give our listeners a little bit of context. Some of the foundation of this historically bipartisan relationship between the United States and Israel, it has really been built on unconditional support for both military aspects, so this shared cooperation with intelligence, quite a long history of supporting each other. And so let's talk a little bit about that history.
Right. So just as you say, the relationship between Israel and the United States goes way back. You could take it all the way back to 1948 when Truman recognizes the state of Israel being one of the first people to move on that front. And since then, the relationship has just gotten stronger over the years, with the U.S. turning into Israel's main supporting international superpower. And that relationship isn't just interest-based, although it is interest-based. It also has deep connections. You hear American speakers and Israeli speakers talk about the value connection and the shared values between the democracies and the societies. You move around here, you sense a lot of around here in Israel, and you get a sense of the connection through the prominence of American culture here, and also the prominence of Israeli affairs and concern for Israel in American politics. And layered on top of all of this and kind of intermingled with it is the connection between major demographics and major groups in American society, Jews on the one hand, and also white evangelical Christians who have a deep connection to Israel and to Zionism. And all of these things create a very deep and profound relationship that traditionally has been pretty bipartisan. So it's not that we didn't see fluctuations between administrations. So the first Bush administration, for instance, had a slightly more confrontational relationship with Israel, and then the Clinton administration, the second Bush administration, had a closer relationship. So these relationships will fluctuate, but throughout history, what we've typically seen is a very, very close relationship. And if you just want to get one number to get a sense of it, Israel has been the biggest recipient of U.S. direct aid since its founding. And since 1959, Israel's gotten about $250 billion in adjusted currency from the U.S. And that's not just buying some service from Israel. It's true deep support that comes from Washington to Israel and that Israel depends on very heavily.
Money speaks volumes typically. When it comes to this type of bipartisan support, even though it ebbs and flows, though, over the past year, we have seen this bipartisan support in the U.S. Start ebbing a little bit more than it's flowing, it seems. And so do you think that this is a trend that's going to continue with the upcoming elections?
So a lot is going to depend on how the elections play out and on how Israeli politics plays out. So some people feel like, I suspect, that there's a deterministic path on which things are going, that we are set to grow further and further apart. And I'm not entirely convinced that that's the case. I think if the U.S. remains on its current trajectory and Israel chooses to remain on its current trajectory, then yes, the rifts are likely to grow, or the tensions are likely to grow more pronounced. I don't think we're facing a collapse of the relationship anytime soon, but the tensions are going to grow more pronounced. So we've talked about how throughout the years there were periods in which it was heightened and periods in which it's lower. I think some of the factors that we've talked about, the value connection, the sense that Israel, this bastion of democracy in the Middle East, and under constant attack and needs America's support, might change with a younger generation that doesn't quite have the same memories of Israel, both as an Israel that pursues certain policies that they might feel more comfortable with, also don't remember the Cold War and the big international rifts that Israel fell on the U.S. side of. But in other respects, there's still a strong and abiding relationship and a strong and abiding support for the state of Israel among the common U.S. electorate and typically within both parties, even if we see that in the margins that's starting to shift more.
Well, and between both parties, we hear from Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. They both say that they are still strong supporters of Israel and the Jewish state. But let's dive into how they show their support for Israel and the Jewish state. What might we expect and what differences arise when it comes to Harris's view on Israel versus Trump's view on Israel?
Right. So it's interesting to think about the fact that even though Trump was already a president and we've seen him in office and how he interacted with Israel, and we've learned a lot from that interaction, there are certain ways in which the Harris presidency, if it comes to be, is much more predictable. Harris is a much more typical politician, for better and for worse, and that means that we're likely to see a continuation of many of the Biden policies. Biden has been often remarked, and we've seen it during his visit here just after October 7th, is deeply connected to the state of Israel. He's got this strong emotional relationship that the current generation of American politicians is less common among this current generation of American politicians, Kamala Harris included. She's still of that generation of politicians that views this relationship as a keystone in U.S. foreign policy and has this strong relationship with the Jewish American community. She is married to a Jewish American man. So there's a lot of that relationship going on. But in terms of the foreign policy and the relationship to Israel, what we can expect is a lot of the same. So should like the war to end in Gaza and in Lebanon, there's likely to be a push. We can talk later if you'd like about the lame duck period. But she's going to strongly push to get a clean slate, at the same time pushing for Israel to accommodate Palestinian humanitarian needs, maybe chart a path towards some sort of two-state solution, even if it feels far-fetched or far away right now. There's going to be a push in that direction. A reticence towards using direct U.S. force that we're also going to see with Trump, but still a commitment of American forces in the region. And in terms of U.S. aid to Israel, maintain current levels. If there is going to be some conditioning of U.S. aid to Israel, it's unlikely to be debated right now. It's likely to show up later. We've already seen an ultimatum letter from the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State, Blinken and Austin, saying that if Israel doesn't meet certain guidelines, it's going to be difficult to meet current Israeli U.S. aid thresholds based on U.S. law, and that's likely to persist. But a strong emphasis both on defense for Israel, but a wish to see Israel move forward on Palestinian statehood and embedding any sort of regional path forward.
And so really maintaining this status quo that we've seen under the Biden administration.
And yes, if we're talking about in terms of the policy directions, yes, it's very likely to be much of the same, not quite exactly the same, so pressure might mount. There's going to be a fresh crop of advisors. Some figures are going to change, not necessarily all of them, but some of the figures in the White House, in the State Department, in her cabinet are likely to shift, and we're likely to see more of that.
As many of her base also has more pressure on her to end the war and possibly put some of these restrictions to the funding if aid requirements are not met and there's not more of a clear vision for post-war Gaza.
Right. Although still here, when we talk about the base is comprised, especially the Democratic base, is comprised of a coalition of forces. So one of the very vocal forces is the anti-war left. There are other forces within the coalition who would like to see Israel being supported and backed. I do think you're right that there's going to be pressure to end the war. What are the leverage? What sort of leverage does she have over Israel that Biden doesn't have? It's not entirely clear. So it's not sure that she has anything to wield other than the fact that she's not up for re-election. So aid might come into play. Right now, people who are close to the campaign indicate that it's not going to come into play. When we think about the Trump presidency, if that comes to be, then the questions, there are many more questions there, surprisingly enough.
Even though he's already been president for 4 years and we've seen his policies on Israel.
Right, on Israel and the region, and he's very vocal on some of these issues. So just yesterday, we saw reports that he's communicated to Netanyahu's team that he expects the war to end by then. Although what he means by expect the war to end by then probably includes many fewer restrictions on Israeli use of force. And if he gets elected, I can't imagine, although, he has a tendency for the unexpected, I can't imagine that he will be highly discomfited if Israel uses still more force than what it's using in Gaza or doesn't commit to humanitarian aid in the way that the Biden administration has asked Israel to commit to. So that's one area in which we can expect something else. In terms of Iran, he's over the years used much more inflammatory rhetoric towards Iran and a willingness to express kind of a confrontational pose. Harris has indicated that she views Iran as an enemy. But still, Trump has over the years been much more vocal in sort of how he positions the U.S. in relationship to Iran.
And we even saw this recently with the Israeli retaliation on Iran. The messaging coming from the Biden-Harris administration was not one that any escalatory, not going after the nuclear sites, versus Trump said that Israel should go after the nuclear sites.
Exactly. What he will say once he's in office and has to deal with the fallout of an Israeli strike is different. I suspect might be different. It doesn't necessarily have to be. Again, this is one of those areas where we have more questions than answers.
Yes.
Because he indicates, and Vance has indicated, his prospective vice president have indicated that they're not keen on bringing the U.S. into its own war in the Middle East if Iran tries to move closer to a nuclear bomb, where that leaves them in relationship to negotiations with Iran or ratcheting up sanctions like they did after Trump exited the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal in 2018. It's difficult to know, again, because you've got this rhetoric on the one hand, and on the other hand, you've got a president who's, at least traditionally, we've seen very, very hesitant on committing U.S. forces in a major way. He ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the head of Quds Force, but he still wasn't very willing to commit the U.S. to another war and tried to roll back the U.S. commitments in Syria and Afghanistan. So in all of these ways, he's kind of he's an interesting character. He's got both of these elements to him. Same goes for U.S. aid to Israel. On the one hand, I can't imagine him conditioning it on U.S. and on Israeli commitment to humanitarian standards. On the other hand, he's been very vocal on wanting U.S. allies to pay their own way. He's done that on NATO. He's done that on Ukraine. And in all of these ways, you can imagine a world, again, I don't know if that's going to be the case, but I can see a world in which he says to Israel, especially if you're not committing to what I'm doing, start paying your own way. I'm not going to support you as much. You can still buy whatever you want to buy in the U.S. You can even buy the stuff that the Biden administration has kind of slowed down the supply of some of the heavier bombs, the heavier munitions that we've needed in Gaza. But he might say, again, I don't know that he will, but we might face a world in which Trump says something like, we expect you to pay for this. And the other thing I would say is he has much more leverage over the current Israeli government than the Harris administration is likely to have. Whether that's good or bad, each viewer can decide for themselves. But Netanyahu over the years has been very, very open to positioning himself as confrontational with Democratic presidents, with Trump much less so, even when he didn't fully like some of the policies. So some of the ideas that Trump had with the deal of the century weren't very popular within Netanyahu's coalition. So, for instance, the idea of committing to a Palestinian state, even if Israel gets to annex a big chunk of the West Bank in the process. but he was much more measured in how he responded to Trump doing so. So if Trump decides to pursue negotiations with Iran, Netanyahu is going to be challenged.
Well, I think that's an interesting point then. When we're looking at these two candidates, we're talking about their perspective on the war in Gaza, their perspective against Iran and nuclear Iran at that. But which of these candidates have more power in the region, in the Middle East region?
It's a great question that I haven't answered to myself in quite that phrasing. So I need a second to think about.
And as you mentioned, there's still so many questions unfolding. And every day, the news cycle is changing, and how each of these candidates might react is also changing.
So the tool set that they have is very similar in certain ways. Where they differ is that Harris is likely to be seen as more reliable, even if not quite as forthcoming in confronting Iran, confronting China, maybe. So in that respect, that's one area where Harris has an advantage in the region. On the other hand, Trump is seen as somebody willing to stand up, willing to at least express a willingness to use a great deal of force, support the use of force, and not hold back some of the allies in their use of force. So in that respect, he's got an advantage. And I think in that way, each of them has different ways of leveraging U.S. power that's constant to both of them in the region in different ways.
And when we talk about the region in different ways also, when we look at the Trump administration, he continues to tout his success with the Abraham Accords and securing these other Arab alliances within the region. Yeah. The Biden administration was also closer than ever for securing a peace deal with Saudi Arabia before October 7th and the ensuing war broke out. So when we look at expanding some of these Arab alliances in the region, who might have more success with those?
Again, each side has certain advantages, and both of them face one challenge. So the Trump administration has the advantage where he might be able to secure certain concessions from Netanyahu that a Harris administration wouldn't be. So if he, for instance, would like to go back to the deal of the century. So the Saudis right now, the Emirates right now, in their own way, for reconstruction in Gaza, are demanding that Israel commit to some sort of path forward to Palestinian statehood. And Israel has been very clear that it's not willing to do so under Netanyahu. Trump, because of the sort of relationship that he has with other leaders, and especially with Israeli leaders, might be able to demand something that Harris won't be able to demand. But it might look very, very different. So if the Saudis are willing to budge and take the Palestinian state of the deal of the century, one that has significant land reduction through Israeli annexation, maybe even in Gaza now, then that's one way to move forward that wouldn't be available to Harris. Harris, on the other hand, might be able to commit to the Saudi demand for Palestinian statehood in a way that Trump doesn't. It's still closer than asking to go back to the deal of the century. And one tool that she has in her arsenal that Trump is unlikely to use is economic pressure against the settler movement in Israel that might compel Israel to yield something in order to avoid ratcheting sanctions against the settler project that right now the administration has started with, and we're likely to see more of if Harris gets elected.
Continuing these similar policies of the Biden administration.
Right.
Something else, Avishay, that you briefly touched on was U.S. troops in the region. When we're talking about counterterrorism throughout Iraq, Syria, Yemen, all of these different areas where U.S. troops have been battling this counterterrorism front as well. Could we expect that to shift or differ depending on the candidates as well?
So in general, Trump is more likely to try to reduce those forces. It's not entirely just up to the two of them, although Trump has made significant moves to shift aside some of the people who held him back in the past. So in his first run as president, the security establishment in the United States held him back. So, for instance, withdrawing forces from Syria or from Afghanistan. It's not likely that we'll see something similar to that magnitude in a second Trump administration, just because of how his world and his advisors have shifted the way they think about appointments to the administration. They're much more committed to appointing people who are loyal to Trump himself into his vision of government. So they're likely to see less resistance there. Where it gets more difficult is that if tensions don't reduce significantly, Trump is not going to be able to reduce forces all the way down if the Houthis are still firing at ships in the Red Sea.
Whoever comes into office will be coming
Exactly.
during one of the most turbulent times in the Middle East.
Exactly. And that's not entirely up to the U.S. to shape. So when you think about Trump signaling to Netanyahu that he would like to enter into office with the war done and over, that might be one of the motivations behind this. I don't want this on my plate.
Neither of these presidents necessarily want to get all of this on their plate. But let's talk about the president who is still in office. You mentioned this lame duck period for President Biden, the remaining month or two following the elections, that he still has some sort of power. But what is it likely that the Biden administration will do with some of this power when it comes to securing their regional interests in the Middle East?
Right. So we're already seeing some of what they're doing. We're seeing a renewed interest in the wake of the Sinwar assassination. You had a conversation with Avishay about this just recently. The successful killing of Yahya Sinwar, they're trying to close down and widen down the war in Gaza. At the same time, we're seeing another renewed push in southern Lebanon, to get a deal between Israel and the Lebanese government around UN Security Resolution 1701 revamped, so Israel has more enforcement and oversight capabilities than it had post-2006. And that effort, to me, seems more likely to succeed, both because there is a bigger Israeli willingness to close down and wind down the effort in Lebanon. It's not quite as threatening to Netanyahu's coalition. Some of his partners have made it entirely clear that they don't believe that a deal in Gaza should be passed. Some of the same people would rather see the war in Lebanon continue, but not quite at the same level of commitment to that issue. And also the sort of successes that Israel has had in Lebanon and the sort of outlook that Israel has in Lebanon. It's a bigger country, it's a bigger space. Hezbollah is a more formidable enemy. Trying to entirely consume or eradicate Hezbollah in the way that Israel has been more successful in doing in Gaza is going to be difficult in a Lebanese context. So that's an effort that's likely to succeed. When you think about Iran, assuming if the Iranians respond and Israel responds back, then we're in a different story. But if the Iranians choose some sort of measured response, maybe one that doesn't trigger another round of Israeli attacks, this time towards more sensitive targets, then I can easily imagine see the Biden administration trying to kickstart the process that Harris would likely try to pursue anyway, and that's the process of negotiations around the nuclear program and Iranian regional involvement. Now that some of its proxies have been taken a step back and reduced in force, there might be an opening to doing something about Iranian regional activities, but definitely there is a need and possibly an opportunity, but definitely a need to do something about the Iranian nuclear program, and the Biden administration might want to hand over to Harris a process that's already ongoing and not something that hasn't even started yet. If Trump gets elected, well, they might still try to start the negotiations. It's difficult to see how the Iranians can imagine continuity between the two administrations, given how the Obama administration, with Biden in the White House, signed the Iran deal, and then the next administration under Trump withdrew from the same deal. So whether they'll be able to successfully start those negotiations when the Iranians know that that new administration is coming in with a whole different set of ideas, that's going to be something we'll have to see down the line.
And especially when it does come to Iran, which is not just a threat to Israel, but a threat to the United States and these Western countries as well. These candidates, whoever is elected, are going to have a lot to grapple with when it comes to all of these developing situations in the Middle East. Avishay, as we are wrapping up this episode of our podcast, I want to ask you some quick rapid-fire questions because we've been going pretty in-depth now. So we're just wanting the first reaction that comes when I ask some of these questions. First, which candidate will prioritize Israel more?
Likely Trump.
Which candidate could provide the most stability to the region?
Likely Harris.
Will the U.S.-Israel alliance remain unconditional, or are more conditions likely to arise with both candidates?
It has never been entirely unconditional. Each candidate will expect different things from Israel. Trump is more likely, in my opinion, to give Israel freedom of action, whereas Harris is more likely to give Israel stability and, expected support in ways that we've come to rely on.
Avishay, as we're wrapping up, Are you worried or are you optimistic about the future of U.S.-Israel relations?
I think we have a lot of areas that we can build on to strengthen them. I do worry that if we stay on our current path, we're growing further apart. And that's bad for both sides. But as an Israeli, I'm more concerned for us than I am for the U.S.
And so that goes into just all of the different questions that still remain leading up to these November 5th elections. It's so much more than just what's happening in the United States. Whatever happens, the outcome will have major implications here in Israel as well. Are you feeling confident that Israel will be able to negotiate whatever implications might arise?
I think Israel has the means and the strength to succeed under any of these conditions.
And it just goes to show, with everything that we've been talking about over the past half hour, just how crucial the U.S.-Israel alliance continues to be. There's such a strong history of this alliance, and hopefully it continues to stay as strong with both of these two candidates, continuing to prioritize Israel and the safety of the region, as there's many implications that it has in the United States as well. Avishay Ben Sasson-Gordis, I so appreciate hearing your insight and analysis when it does come to the upcoming U.S. elections and the impact right here in Israel as well. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the National Security Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And to all of our listeners as well, that wraps up this latest edition of the National Security Podcast in partnership with INSS. You can join us next week for more in-depth discussion on the latest security issues facing Israel today.